A police officer trails a homeless child to an abandoned house. The truth he uncovers is more terrifying than he ever expected. The streets of Atlanta hummed with life that evening. Officer Jason Reynolds had long since grown accustomed to the city's nocturnal rhythm. Neon signs flickered against the backdrop of honking cars, and laughter spilled from bars and restaurants. But something about this night felt different. It was the child who caught his attention first. A black child, no older than 7, her small frame half hidden beneath an oversized hoodie, the frayed hem dragging along the pavement as she moved. She clutched a tattered teddy bear to her chest, her fingers white-knuckled around its worn-out fur. Jason's gaze sharpened as he saw what happened next. A burger had been left unattended on the outdoor counter of a McDonald's, a careless mistake by some distracted customer. In a swift, desperate motion, the girl reached up, snatched the food, and darted away. Jason stiffened. He had seen plenty of petty theft before, children who had learned to steal before they learned to read. But this wasn't the careless swagger of a street-smart kid. No, there was fear in the way she moved, the way she glanced over her shoulder, eyes darting through the crowd as if she expected someone to emerge and snatch her back. She wasn't a thief. She was running. Jason fell into step behind her, maintaining a distance. He had no intention of scaring her, not yet. His years on the force had taught him that children like this were skittish, wired for survival. Approached too soon, too forcefully, and she'd bolt before he could even ask her name. She wove through the city streets, slipping between groups of pedestrians like a whisper. He followed, his senses sharpening with each turn. The bright, bustling cityscape slowly gave way to dimly lit avenues where the warm glow of streetlights grew sparse and the buildings loomed darker, more unwelcoming. This wasn't a place for a child. Not at this hour. Still, she pressed forward. Her tiny frame tensed, her grip on the teddy bear tightening. Whatever she was running from, it had burrowed deep inside her. Jason's stomach knotted. Who was she looking for? Or worse, who was she running from? By the time they reached the edge of a small park, she hesitated. The trees stretched long shadows across the pavement, swallowing the dim glow of the street lamps behind them. She stood there for a moment, shifting from foot to foot, as if torn between staying and going. Then, just like that, she made her decision. She darted forward, her little feet kicking up dry leaves as she entered the park's depths. Jason exhaled slowly, running a hand along the side of his belt. His gun remained holstered, his radio secured, every piece of his equipment where it needed to be. Years of training had drilled this into him. Assess before you act. But as he watched the child disappear beyond the trees, something deeper than training pushed him forward. He couldn't let her go. The park was silent, save for the occasional rustle of branches swaying in the cool autumn breeze. Jason followed her path, his boots crunching softly against the dirt. The deeper he went, the darker it became. The city's glow faded into the distance, swallowed by the thick canopy above. Somewhere ahead, the girl was still moving. He could hear it, the light pattern of small feet against the forest floor, but she wasn't sprinting anymore. She was slowing down. Jason took a careful breath and called out, "Hey, sweetheart, wait up." His voice was steady, low, non-threatening. But she didn't stop. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder one last time, her wide, fearful eyes locking onto his for a fraction of a second, before she turned and vanished into the trees. Jason hesitated only for a second, his pulse steady but alert. The forest loomed ahead, its tangled branches whispering in the wind, swallowing what little light remained from the city behind him. The girl was small, quick if he lost sight of her now. Finding her again in the dark would be nearly impossible. His voice cut through the cold night air, steady but urgent. "Hey, wait!" But the girl was already slipping away, her small figure swallowed by the shadows between the trees. And then she was gone. Jason paused for the briefest moment, his instincts taking over. His fingers brushed against the radio clipped to his shoulder, ensuring the connection was live. His sidearm remained firm in its holster, untouched, but present. Years of experience had taught him that danger often lurked in the most unexpected places. Satisfied, he moved. The forest pressed in around Jason, thick with shadows that danced under the wavering beam of his flashlight. The crisp autumn air had turned sharp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. He moved swiftly, boots crunching against the undergrowth, his breath steady but his pulse quickening. He swept the flashlight from side to side, searching. Then a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, but there. A soft rustling ahead, like fabric brushing against wood. Jason stiffened, his muscles tensing with instinctive caution. Slowly, he advanced. The first thing he saw was a house, half buried in the darkness. It was a forgotten relic, long since surrendered to time, its roof sagging, windows shattered, vines creeping up the warped wooden walls. The front door hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind, beckoning him inside like an open wound in the night. Jason stepped forward, his flashlight slicing through the gloom. The beam landed on something small, hunched near the corner of the room. The girl. She was curled behind an overturned table, knees drawn to her chest, the teddy bear still clutched tightly in her grasp. Even in the dim light, Jason could see the way her shoulders trembled, the tension in her tiny fingers. He exhaled slowly, crouching to her level. "Hey, sweetheart. You're safe now." She didn't speak, didn't move. Instead, she lifted a shaking hand and pointed. Jason followed her gaze to a hallway at the far end of the room, a narrow passage swallowed in darkness. A familiar unease settled in his chest. He had spent years walking into the unknown, but there was something about the quiet, about the way the girl refused to look at it directly, that made his gut tighten. "Is someone back there?" he asked softly. No answer, only the trembling hand, still pointing. Jason swallowed, then rose to his feet. The wooden floor groaned under his weight as he stepped forward, each creak an unwelcome reminder of just how wrong this place felt. The deeper he ventured, the clearer the signs became. This house was not abandoned. Against the walls, makeshift bedding was arranged in uneven rows. Old blankets, flattened cardboard, a few battered pillows. Scattered across the floor were the remains of hastily eaten meals, empty water bottles, crumpled fast food wrappers, a crushed soda can. Someone had lived here. Recently. Jason's chest tightened. His mind was already assembling the pieces, trying to form a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Then, from the corner of the room, a sound, soft, hesitant, a whisper of movement. Jason swung the flashlight toward a large wooden wardrobe tucked against the far wall. His grip instinctively tightened around his belt, his body ready for whatever came next. A long pause. Then, with a slow, careful hand, he reached out and pulled the door open. Inside, a boy huddled in the shadows. He was smaller than the girl, maybe 4 years old, his wide brown eyes staring up at Jason with a mixture of fear and something else, something older than a child should carry. He had been hiding there for a long time. The girl moved then, rushing forward, dropping to her knees beside the boy and wrapping her arms around him in a protective embrace. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Billy." Jason exhaled, his breath steadying. 2 kids, not lost, hiding. This wasn't just a case of a runaway child. Something had happened to them, something that made them too afraid to speak, too afraid to trust. Kneeling down once more, Jason kept his voice gentle. "Hey, buddy, my name's Jason. I'm with the police." Billy's eyes darted toward him, his small body trembling against the girl's side. Jason could see the way his tiny fingers dug into her sleeve, clinging to her like she was the only thing keeping him grounded. "I'm here to help," Jason said. "I promise." The girl shook her head, not out of defiance, out of fear. Jason felt it then, the weight of their silence, the years of learned distrust. These kids had lived in fear for far too long, and now, even in the presence of someone who could help, their first instinct was to protect themselves, to expect the worst. They had been let down before. Jason sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew authority wouldn't work here. They didn't need a cop. They needed a way out. He shifted, softening his posture. "All right, listen. You don't want to talk? That's okay. But let me ask you something." The girl's eyes flickered up. "Do you want to stay here?" Jason asked. A long silence. Then, hesitantly, both children shook their heads. "All right," he nodded, pushing himself up. "Then let's go. Anywhere you want. You pick." Still, they hesitated. Jason sighed, then chuckled lightly, offering the smallest hint of warmth in the cold room. "Tell you what, you come with me, and the first thing we do? We stop for burgers and fries. Sounds good?" For the first time since he'd found them, they hesitated for a different reason. Billy looked up at the girl, uncertainty flickering in his tired little eyes. She stared back, as if weighing something heavy in her mind. Then, finally, she gave a single, small nod. Jason stood near the children, his mind working through the next steps. They had to leave immediately. But just as he reached for the door, a low rumble cut through the quiet. A vehicle. Jason froze. The headlights flared through the broken windows, flooding the dusty room with an unnatural glow. A truck, large, heavy. It came to an abrupt stop just beyond the trees. Then the doors slammed open. Two figures emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, their silhouettes framed against the dim streetlights beyond the forest's edge. Even from this distance, Jason recognized the way they moved, predatory, with purpose. These weren't men looking for lost children. They were hunting something, or someone. Jason's stomach tightened. They had come back. "Get down," he whispered. The girl reacted first, pulling Billy with her as they scurried behind an overturned table, their small bodies pressing against the shadows. Jason took a controlled breath, his fingers grazing the grip of his gun. He couldn't let them see the children. A voice rang out, low, gruff, laced with impatience. "Where are they?" Footsteps creaked against the porch. The floorboards groaned under the weight of the approaching men. Jason pressed himself deeper into the darkness, his pulse steady despite the rising tension. "You sure they're still here?" one of them muttered. "Yeah, truck's gone. Nobody's taking them without us knowing." Jason's jaw clenched. They were organized. This wasn't random. These men knew exactly what they were doing. A metallic clink echoed in the silence. A gun being cocked. Jason exhaled, his focus narrowing. Time was running out. The first man entered the house, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. His partner followed closely behind, sweeping a flashlight across the room, its harsh beam cutting through the dust-filled air. Jason could see the tension in their shoulders, the anticipation of a fight just beneath their skin. One of them kicked over a pile of debris, frustration creeping into his voice. "Damn kids! If they ran, we'll have to—" He didn't finish his sentence. His flashlight landed on Jason. For a split second, neither of them moved. Then, everything happened at once. The man lunged. Jason sidestepped, driving his forearm into the attacker's ribs, twisting his weight to send him crashing against the wall. But the second man was already moving. His hand dipping toward his belt, Jason saw the flash of steel before the knife swung toward him. Jason barely managed to pivot, the blade slicing just past his ribs. His instincts kicked in. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, but his attacker was relentless. He threw a punch, but Jason was faster, driving his knee into the man's stomach before slamming an elbow into his jaw. The first attacker recovered, lunging again. Jason met him head-on, dodging a wild swing and countering with a powerful blow to the ribs. The man staggered, gasping for breath, but Jason didn't give him time to recover. He grabbed the back of his head and drove it down hard against the floor. The struggle lasted less than a minute, a violent blur of instinct and precision. Then, finally, silence. The men lay motionless, their bodies sprawled across the wreckage of the room. Jason steadied himself, breathing heavily. His knuckles throbbed, his muscles coiled with adrenaline, but there was no time to linger. They weren't safe yet. A sound, distant at first, but unmistakable. An engine. Jason's head snapped toward the doorway. Through the shattered window, headlights flickered in the distance, cutting through the night. Gravel crunched under heavy tires as a second truck barreled down the path leading toward them. They weren't alone. Jason's chest tightened. More of them. He didn't wait to confirm the number. He turned sharply toward the children, his voice firm but hushed. "We have to go. Now." The girl nodded instantly, tightening her grip on Billy's small hand. Jason scooped up his flashlight, then, without looking back, led them through the rear entrance, out into the cold embrace of the night. The forest loomed ahead, a dark and tangled refuge. Jason didn't hesitate. He pulled the children close, guiding them into the trees, just as the second truck skidded to a stop in front of the house. Behind them, doors slammed. Angry voices cut through the night air. "What the hell happened there?" "They're gone! Spread out, find them!" Jason quickened his pace, his boots careful against the damp earth. Each step was deliberate, silent. He could hear the children breathing heavily beside him, their small feet struggling to match his strides. The girl clung to her teddy bear, holding it as though it were the last piece of her world. Billy, barely keeping up, tripped once, but caught himself before Jason had to grab him. He didn't have to tell them to be quiet. They already knew. 100 yards in, Jason slowed, scanning the terrain. The forest was thick, but the moonlight cut through in patches, revealing sloping ground ahead. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He crouched, pulling the children down with him behind a fallen tree. Their breaths came in short, panicked gasps. "Listen to me," Jason murmured, keeping his voice low. "We're going to stay here for a moment. No sound, no movement. You understand?" The girl nodded. Billy swallowed hard, but mimicked her. Jason turned his attention back toward the house, just in time to see flashlights flickering through the trees. The men had already spread out, their beams sweeping through the underbrush. One of them was heading straight for them. Jason's grip on his weapon tightened. He pressed himself lower against the tree, shielding the children as best he could. The crunch of boots on twigs grew louder. A beam of light passed within feet of them, illuminating the side of Jason's face for a fraction of a second before shifting away. Jason didn't breathe. Neither did the children. The man hesitated. Jason could hear the radio crackle on his belt. "Anything?" a voice demanded from the other end. A long pause. Jason could see the man's shadow shift, indecisive. Then, a noise, a rustling above them. Jason's pulse spiked. He turned his head just enough to see a large owl perched on a low branch, ruffling its feathers. The moment stretched unbearably. Then, With a sudden burst of movement, the bird took flight, its wings slicing through the air. The man jumped back, startled, his flashlight jerking wildly. Jason seized the moment. With practiced precision, he reached down, squeezing the girl's hand once before motioning deeper into the trees. She understood instantly, tugging Billy along as they began to move again. They slipped away, silent as shadows. The trail they followed was narrow, winding through the dense forest like an old, forgotten path. Jason kept them moving, though his ears remained trained on the sounds behind them, still too close for comfort. After a few minutes, he finally risked stopping. He took a breath, then pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds, badge 304. I need immediate backup. 2 children recovered, but we are not secure. Suspects in pursuit." The response came fast, the voice on the other end sharp and alert. "Copy, Officer Reynolds. Nearest unit is en route. ETA, 15 minutes. 15 minutes? Jason exhaled, glancing at the children. They were exhausted. He could see it in their small, shivering frames. The girl was holding up well, her expression set with quiet determination. But Billy looked like he was barely keeping himself together. Jason pressed his radio again. "Make it 10. He turned back to the children, his expression softening despite the urgency. "You're doing great," he said. "We're almost there. Just a little longer." Billy didn't respond. His small fingers were curled into Lena's sleeve, his face half hidden in the fabric. The girl finally spoke, her voice small but steady. "Where will we go?" Jason met her eyes. There was so much in them, too much for someone so young. "Anywhere you want," he promised. "But first, let's get you safe." The forest had settled into a tense stillness, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the midnight breeze. Jason knelt beside the children, his breath steadying from the long chase. The worst of the immediate danger had passed for now, but his mind was far from at ease. He needed answers. Gently he turned to the girl, her small frame still curled protectively around the younger boy. She had been strong, silent, cautious. But now, with a moment of pause, Jason could see the exhaustion creeping into her posture, the weight of something far older than her years pressing onto her tiny shoulders. "Hey," he murmured, careful not to startle her. "Can you tell me your name?" A long silence stretched between them. Then finally she spoke, soft, barely above a whisper. "Lena," she said. "Lena Bennett." Jason's breath hitched. The name lodged itself in his memory, familiar yet elusive, like a song half remembered. His mind raced, flipping through countless reports, missing person cases, crime bulletins, and then it clicked. Bennett. The name was carved into a case that had haunted the department for years. Slowly, Lena reached into the oversized hoodie she wore, her small hands trembling slightly. Jason watched as she pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges worn with time. She held it out to him. He took it carefully, unfolding it under the dim glow of his flashlight. A photograph. A man and a woman stood in its faded frame, smiling, their arms wrapped tightly around a little girl nestled between them. The child was young, barely 4, but the eyes were unmistakable. Lena. Jason's grip tightened around the photo. His pulse quickened as realization settled in. He had seen this image before. It had hung on the wall of the station for years, one of the few unsolved cases that no one had ever been able to close. The Bennett accident. A tragic wreck on a desolate highway. A couple found dead, their car mangled beyond recognition, and their daughter missing, no body, no trace, just gone. until now. Jason looked back at Lena, his throat tight. "Lena, do you remember what happened?" She hesitated, gripping the teddy bear tighter, her fingers curling around its worn fabric. "There was a crash," she murmured. "I remember the glass, and the lights, and the noise." Her voice trembled. "I remember screaming." She shut her eyes for a moment, as if trying to push the memories away. "Then someone pulled me out." Jason's stomach twisted. "Who?" Lena shook her head. I don't know. They told me my parents were gone, that I had nowhere else to go." Her voice wavered, and Jason could hear the raw pain buried beneath it. "They lied." Jason swallowed hard. He had spent years piecing together broken truths, but this was something different. Lena had never been lost. She had been taken. Billy stirred beside her, his small face half hidden behind her arm. Jason's gaze shifted to him, his mind piecing together the final chilling realization. "And Billy?" he asked. Lena nodded slowly. "They took him too." Jason exhaled sharply. It all made sense now. These weren't just lost children. They were victims. The house, the supplies, the hidden paths, it had all been a part of something larger. The people who took them weren't just criminals. They were running an operation. Jason clenched his jaw. Who else had they taken? How many others were still out there? His grip tightened around the radio. He had to get them out, now. But before he could act, a gunshot split the night. Jason reacted on instinct, his body moving before his mind caught up. He lunged, shielding the children as the bullet tore through the trees behind them. A second shot rang out, closer this time. They had found them. Jason's hand went to his holster in one swift motion. His heart pounded as he pressed the children low to the ground. "Stay down!" he ordered. The flashlights in the distance shifted, searching, closing in. Voices barked commands, angry and sharp. Jason counted the seconds between each shot, calculating his options. He couldn't return fire blindly, not with the kids so exposed. "We're almost out of time," he muttered under his breath. The radio crackled against his shoulder. "Officer Reynolds, units are approaching your location. ETA 5 minutes. Not soon enough." Jason exhaled, forcing himself to think fast. The forest was dense, but he had spent years navigating terrain like this. If he could create a diversion, draw their attention away, the children might have a chance to slip further into the darkness. He turned to Lena, his voice urgent but steady. "Listen to me. When I say go, you take Billy and run. Follow that path there, straight toward the road." Her eyes widened. "But no arguments," Jason cut in. He softened his tone. "Trust me, I'll be right behind you." Lena hesitated, but then, finally, she nodded. Jason took a breath, adjusting his stance. Then, in one sharp motion, he fired into the air. The gunshot shattered the silence, sending shockwaves through the trees. The voices behind them erupted in confusion, flashlights whipping in his direction. Jason turned to the kids, his voice calm, firm, absolute. "Go!" Lena grabbed Billy's hand, and then, without looking back, they ran. Jason took position, gripping his weapon as the shadows surged toward him. He would hold them off, whatever it took. The distant hum of sirens was still too far, their promise of safety not yet within reach. The darkness stretched wide, swallowing the space between predator and prey, and Jason was running out of time. Somewhere in the shadows, Lena and Billy were still moving, their small feet carrying them toward the distant road. But behind him, danger was closing in. A twig snapped. Jason turned just in time to see a figure step from the trees, a tall man, broad-shouldered, gun raised, his silhouette barely visible beneath the thin slivers of moonlight. Jason didn't move. His heartbeat slowed, his breath controlled. The man's finger rested against the trigger, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "Don't do anything stupid," the man warned, his voice low, edged with authority. Jason weighed his options. The gun was too close. One wrong move, and he wouldn't get another chance. But hesitation wasn't an option either. So he acted. With a sharp, explosive movement, Jason lunged from the underbrush, his body colliding with the man's in a forceful strike. The gun went off, a deafening crack tearing through the air, but the bullet missed, embedding itself into the tree behind them. Jason drove his fist into the man's face, feeling the crunch of bone beneath his knuckles. The man stumbled backward, but he wasn't down yet. He swung wildly, catching Jason in the ribs. Pain flared, but Jason gritted his teeth, ignoring it. He pivoted, using the momentum to land a sharp blow to the man's side. The attacker hit the ground, dazed but not unconscious. Jason was about to press forward when, "Stop!" A second man emerged from the trees, his gun already leveled. Jason froze, his breath still heavy from the fight. "Drop it," the man ordered. Jason's grip tightened around his weapon, but he wasn't fast enough this time. He had lost the upper hand. Slowly, reluctantly, he let the gun fall to the earth. A satisfied smirk crept onto the man's face. "Smart choice," he sneered, stepping closer. Jason braced himself, waiting, calculating. Then, from behind, a sharp whistle cut through the air. The attacker barely had time to react before a rock came flying from the darkness, striking him hard against the temple. His aim faltered. Jason didn't hesitate. He exploded into motion, seizing the moment, driving his shoulder into the man's torso, knocking him off balance. The gun fired a wild shot into the night, but Jason was already twisting, yanking the man's arm downward, sending him crashing to the ground. A quick, forceful strike, and it was over. The forest fell silent. Jason turned, his pulse still racing, and there, standing just beyond the trees, was Lena. Her small chest rose and fell rapidly, her hand still clenched around another rock. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, but she'd saved his life. Jason exhaled, his adrenaline ebbing into something deeper, something heavier. "That was dangerous," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. Lena didn't flinch. "You were in trouble," she murmured. Jason let out a small, breathy chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah," he admitted. "Guess I was." Then, in the distance, sirens. The sound cut through the stillness, growing louder, the flashing lights breaking through the thick woods. Help had arrived. Jason stepped back, watching as officers poured into the clearing. The scene unfolded quickly. Men in uniform swarming, securing the area, placing handcuffs on the fallen attackers. The ones who had terrorized these children, their reign was over. He turned toward Lena and Billy as two paramedics approached. "Let's get you checked out, all right?" Jason said softly. Lena hesitated, then nodded, finally allowing herself to be led toward safety. Billy clung to her hand, refusing to let go. The night had been long. The danger had been real. But it is over now. Jason ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow breath as he watched the two children settle into the back of a patrol car. For the first time since this night began, they were safe. Lena turned back, her eyes meeting him through the open door. Tea time. Jason saw something different there. Not fear. No hesitation. Jason swallowed for the first word, nodding once. "You're going to be okay now," he assured her. And this time, she believed him. The streets of the small town were quiet as Jason pulled the car to a stop in front of the house. The porch light cast a golden glow against the crisp night air, illuminating the weathered beams of the old home. Jason shifted in his seat, glancing at Lena. She sat motionless beside him, her small hands curled in her lap, the tattered teddy bear still clutched tightly to her chest. Her face was unreadable, but he could see the way her fingers trembled. "They're waiting for you," he said softly. Lena's gaze lifted to the house. Two figures stood on the porch, an elderly couple, their bodies tense with anticipation. The woman clutched the railing, her other hand pressed to her mouth, her frail shoulders shaking with emotion. Beside her, the man stood rigid, his grip firm against the wooden post as though it was the only thing keeping him upright. Lena exhaled shakily, and then she moved. The car door swung open, and before Jason could say anything more, she ran. The woman let out a broken cry, stumbling forward as Lena threw herself into her arms. The man followed, wrapping them both in his embrace, his lined face crumpling with overwhelming relief. Tears mixed with whispered words, words of love, of disbelief, of the endless nights spent waiting, searching, hoping. Jason stepped out of the car but kept his distance, watching as three souls, once separated by tragedy, now clung to one another as if they would never let go. And in that moment, he knew Lena was home. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the scent of old wood and faded memories. Framed photographs lined the walls, capturing moments of joy frozen in time. A young couple holding their baby girl, a toddler laughing in the summer sun, a family whole and unbroken. Lena stood before them, her small fingers tracing the images. "They never stop looking for you," Jason murmured, standing beside her. Her eyes lingered on a particular photo, her parents, smiling, alive, holding her between them as if she were their entire world. "I thought—" Lena hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was alone." Jason placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You never were." A soft sniffle broke the silence, and they turned to find Billy peering up at them, his small face uncertain. Jason crouched, offering a reassuring smile. "We've got something else for you too, buddy." Billy's parents had been found. They had searched desperately for their son, their grief stretching over months of hopelessness, until now. The moment they learned he was alive, they had dropped everything, racing to reclaim the little boy they thought they had lost forever. When Billy saw them, standing in the doorway, his breath hitched. His mother let out a strangled sob, her hands covering her mouth. His father, a man who had likely spent every night cursing himself for not protecting his son, took a shaky step forward. Billy hesitated for only a second, and then, with an anguished cry, he ran into their arms. As the room quieted, a new conversation emerged. Billy's parents listened, their faces drawn with sorrow, as Lena recounted everything. The missing years, the danger, the pain Lena had endured. And then, without hesitation, they made a decision. "She's family now," Billy's mother said firmly, her voice thick with emotion. "She belongs with us." Jason saw the hesitation in Lena's grandparents, the love in their eyes battling against the reality of their age. They had waited so long for this moment, but they knew, deep down, they couldn't give Lena the future she deserved. "She will always have a home here," her grandmother whispered, cupping Lena's tear-streaked face. "But you need more than we can give, sweetheart." Lena swallowed, her gaze shifting to Billy. He was watching her, silent but hopeful. Slowly, tentatively, she reached for his hand, and when he squeezed back, she knew she would never be alone again. Weeks later, the town gathered in celebration. The community center buzzed with energy, filled with warm laughter and heartfelt conversations. At the front of the room, beneath a banner that read, "Thank you, Officer Reynolds," Jason stood uncomfortably, his hands shoved into his pockets as the mayor finished his speech. In the face of great danger, he chose to act, the mayor declared. And because of his courage, 2 children who were once lost have now found their way home. Applause erupted, but Jason barely heard it. His gaze had already drifted to Lena, standing beside Billy and their parents. She was different now, her face no longer shadowed with fear, her posture no longer stiff with guardedness. She smiled easily, laughed freely. She was safe. She was happy. As the clapping faded, Lena broke away from her family, making her way toward him. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around him, pressing her small frame against his. "You saved me," she whispered. Jason felt his throat tighten. "You saved yourself, kid," he murmured, patting her back gently. "I just helped you find the way." Lena pulled back, her eyes shining. "Thank you." Jason swallowed hard, nodding once. And as he watched her return to the people who would love and protect her, he realized something. There would always be more cases, more dangers, more nights spent chasing shadows. But this moment, this victory, this life saved, this was why he did it. And that, my friends, is the story of how a little girl who was once lost found her way home. A story of resilience, of hope, and of the unexpected heroes who step into our lives when we need them most. Lena and Billy's journey wasn't just about survival. It was about rediscovering love, trust, and family. And Jason, he may have thought he was just doing his job, but in the end, he gave those kids something no badge or title could ever match: a second chance at life. Stories like this remind us that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear a uniform, a weary expression, and carry the weight of the world on their shoulders, choosing every day to stand between the innocent and the darkness that lurks just beyond. And hey, if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and stir the soul. Until next time, stay safe, stay hopeful, and never stop believing in the power of a second chance.